The knife was already at Samuel Brooks's throat when Glacia Wildheart stepped through the crowd of dockhands and put her axe against the man's wrist. "Drop it," she said, "or lose the hand." The man holding Samuel was called Farron Dask, a broad-shouldered harbor tough who worked for the new harbormaster, and he had a blade pressed hard enough against Samuel's stubbled jaw that a thin line of blood had already welled up. Around them, the whole of Saltmere's lower dock had gone still. Fishwives with baskets on their hips, rope makers with their hands frozen mid-coil. A dozen dockhands who, moments before, had been laughing at the joke that Farron's crew had made of dragging the shipwright out of his boat shed by the collar. "This isn't your business, Orc," Farron said, though his voice had gone thin. "I am making it my business." Glacia's voice was low and even, but there was a promise buried in it, the kind of promise that made men remember they had families waiting on them. She was a head taller than Farron, her shoulders wide beneath fitted leather armor the color of old rust, laced tight across her chest, and cinched at a waist that still curved despite the muscle roped along her arms. A short cloak, salt-stained and travel-worn, hung from one shoulder, pinned by a bronze clasp shaped like a broken tusk. Her black hair was bound back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulder blade, and her tusks, small for an orc woman, caught the gray morning light when she spoke. Her eyes were a deep amber, sharp as a hawk circling for the kill. "He owes the harbormaster 3 months of berth fees," Farron said, though he did not lower the knife. "Owes them, and the tide's coming in on the excuse." "Then take it out of his coin, not his throat." Glacia's axe did not waver. "A man who kills a debtor collects no debt. Only a fool bleeds gold out of a corpse." Samuel, who had not said a word since the knife found his neck, watched the orc woman with a strange, dizzy sort of wonder, even as his pulse hammered beneath the blade. He did not know her. He had seen orc traders come through Saltmere before, mostly rough merchants haggling over rope and pitch, but never one who carried herself like a queen surveying a battlefield of insects. He was aware, distantly, that this was perhaps the worst possible moment to notice how the low sun caught the line of her throat, but some part of him noticed it anyway, filed it away for later, the way a drowning man might notice the color of the sky. Farron's eyes flicked between the axe and the crowd, weighing whether his employer's coin was worth losing a hand over. It was not. He shoved Samuel backward, hard enough that Samuel stumbled against a mooring post and caught himself, one palm splitting on the rough wood. "Tell the harbormaster he wants his fees. He can come collect them himself," Farron spat, sheathing his knife with a theatrical flourish meant to look like he'd chosen to walk away rather than been made to. "And you," he pointed at Glacia, "orcs aren't welcome on this dock. Ask anyone." "I did not ask," Glacia said. "I told." Farron retreated with his 2 companions trailing after him, throwing glances back over their shoulders like dogs who'd been swatted with a broom, but wanted to remember where the meat had been. The crowd began to unknot, murmuring, some already turning away as though embarrassed to have watched, others staring openly at the orc woman still standing with her axe loose in one hand. Samuel pressed the back of his wrist to the cut on his jaw and looked up at her. "I didn't ask for help," he said, which was not quite gratitude, though he meant it as gratitude's rougher cousin. "No," Glacia agreed. "You did not." She looked him over the way a woman might look over a horse she was considering buying, though there was something warmer beneath the assessment, something that made Samuel's ears go hot despite the cold wind coming off the harbor. "But you would have lost that hand yourself, trying to pull his wrist away with the other. Bad angle. You would have opened your own throat trying to save it." "I've had worse days," Samuel said, which was mostly a lie, and stood up straighter, brushing splinters from his palm. He was a plain-looking man, not tall, built with the corded strength of someone who spent his days hauling timber and driving pegs into hulls, with sandy hair that the sea wind had turned perpetually unruly, and a jaw that even now, bleeding, held a stubborn set to it. He was 31 years old and had spent the better part of 15 of those years alone on this dock, first as an apprentice, now as the man who owned the boat shed at the end of it, though owning was a generous word for a debt that never seemed to shrink no matter how many keels he laid. "I doubt that," Glacia said, and there was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile but its ambitious cousin. "Most men who say that have never truly had a worse day. I have seen men say it while missing an arm." She slung her axe back into the leather harness at her hip. "I am Glacia Wildheart. I came into this harbor an hour ago looking for a shipwright who does not cheat honest folk on repairs. I was told to ask for a man called Samuel Brooks." Samuel blinked. "That's me." "Then it seems," Glacia said, "that I have already done you a favor before you've done me one. That puts you in my debt, shipwright. I collect debts more patiently than that fool with the knife, but I do collect them." Something in the way she said it, low and amused and entirely too pleased with herself, made Samuel's mouth twitch despite the blood still cooling on his jaw. "Is that so?" "It is so." She looked past him down the dock toward the boat shed with its half-built hull propped on trestles, canvas sails furled and waiting. "Is that yours? 20 years of my life, more or less." "Good," Glacia said. "I need it repaired and quickly, and I do not care what it costs so long as it is done honestly. Will you take my coin, Samuel Brooks, or must I threaten someone else's throat first to prove I am serious?" Samuel found himself laughing, a short surprised bark of a sound that startled even him, given that a man had held a blade to him 10 minutes prior. "No," he said. "No, I believe you. Come on then. Let's see what needs fixing." He turned toward the shed, and only then did he notice the boat she meant, moored at the far end of the dock where the water ran deep enough for a proper hull. A lean, sea-worn cutter with a splintered rail and a gash along her port side that looked less like storm damage and more like she had scraped hard against rock in a hurry, running from something. He filed that thought away too, the way he had filed away the color of her throat, and did not ask, not yet. The boat, Glacia explained once they had walked its length and Samuel had run his calloused hands along the wounded hull, had come through Slate Head Passage 2 nights before, running from a patrol boat flying the colors of Saltmere's new harbormaster. She said this plainly, without shame, the way a woman states whether. "You're a smuggler," Samuel said. It was not quite an accusation. He had lived on this coast long enough to know that half the men who called themselves honest traders in Saltmere had a second ledger somewhere they did not show the tax collector, and that the line between smuggler and merchant here was drawn more by luck than virtue. "I am a courier," Glacia said, "for people who do not trust your harbormaster's tolls, and given what I have seen of him and his hired knives, I do not blame them." "That's Aldrich Vane you're talking about," Samuel said, lowering his voice out of old habit even though there was no one near enough to hear. "Careful how loud you say that. Should I fear him? Everyone fears him a little. He didn't used to run this harbor. Old harbormaster Corin died of a fever 2 winters back, sudden as anything, and Vane turned up with a paper claiming Corin had named him successor on his deathbed. No one who was actually there to witness it is left to say otherwise. Corin's own daughter disputed it, but she had no proof, and Vane had men with swords standing behind his paper, so Samuel shrugged, a small, tired gesture. "Paper 1. Glacia's eyes had sharpened at that, the amusement gone out of them entirely, replaced by something colder and more considering. "A man seizes a harbor on the strength of an unwitnessed deathbed letter, and no one questioned it. Some did, quietly. The ones who questioned it loudest aren't around to keep questioning. Dead. Gone, sailed off, or so it's said. No bodies if that's what you're asking, just gone, and no one saw them go." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Corin's daughter, Wren, she still lives up past the cliffs, keeps to herself. I check on her when I can. She won't talk about it. I think she's afraid to." Glacia was quiet for a long moment, studying the ruined hull as though it had become less interesting than what Samuel had just told her. Then she said, in a tone that made the hair on Samuel's arms rise, "I did not come here only to smuggle salt and dyed cloth past a greedy harbormaster's toll booth, Samuel Brooks. I came because the people who hired me to run this route," said Vane, "has been paying pirates out of the Slate Head Caves to harass any boat that will not pay his private toll on top of the harbor's official one. I was hoping to find proof. Instead, I nearly lost a hull and found a shipwright with an honest face and a dangerous mouth. My mouth isn't dangerous. It called me a smuggler to my face within an hour of meeting me. That is either very brave or very stupid, and I have not yet decided which I prefer in a man. The corner of her mouth curled again, warmer this time, and Samuel felt that curl land somewhere low in his chest, unwelcome and undeniable. Fix my boat, shipwright. And while you do, tell me more about this wren, and this vein, and these caves beneath the cliffs where pirates seem to nest so comfortably. It took 6 days to repair the hull properly, and in those 6 days, Samuel Brooks learned more about wanting something than he had in the previous decade of his solitary life. It was not only that Glacia was beautiful, though she was, in a way that had nothing polite or delicate about it, broad through the shoulder, strong-legged, with a face that could have been carved from the same weathered stone as the cliffs above the harbor, all sharp planes and amber eyes, and a mouth that curved sly and slow when she was pleased with herself, which was often. It was the way she worked alongside him rather than simply waiting, sanding a rail smooth with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hauling timber that would have taken 2 ordinary men, teasing him mercilessly when he fumbled a measurement, laughing outright, head thrown back, when he dropped an entire jar of pitch across his own boots. "You do this for a living," she said on the 3rd evening, watching him carefully recaulk a seam by lantern light, "and yet you still manage to cover yourself in more pitch than the boat." "I have a gift," Samuel said, not looking up. "You have a curse. I have never met a man so competent with his hands and so hopeless with his own boots." "I don't recall asking for a review of my boots." "You did not have to ask. I give my opinions freely, shipwright. It is one of my many gifts." She crouched beside him, closer than strictly necessary, and took the caulking iron from his hand to examine the seam herself, her fingers brushing his in the process, and Samuel felt that small contact travel up his arm like a spark finding dry kindling. "This is good work," she said, more quietly. "You care about it." "I have watched men build things only because someone paid them to. You are not one of them." "It's the one thing I've ever been good at," Samuel admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "I don't have family left in Saltmere. No wife, no children, no kin who write. Just this shed and the boats that come through it, and mostly I like it that way. There's an honesty to wood and pitch and rope. It doesn't lie to you the way people can. And yet you defended Ren Corin's claim to me, a stranger without being asked, at some risk to your own comfort with the man who runs this harbor," Glacia said. "That does not sound like a man who prefers wood to people." Samuel considered that. "Maybe I like being alone. Doesn't mean I like watching wrongs go unrighted." Glacia studied him for a long moment in the lantern light, something unreadable moving behind her amber eyes, and then she said, low, "I think, Samuel Brooks, that you are a lonelier man than you let yourself admit, and a braver one than you know. Both things can be true of the same man. I have known warriors twice your size who had neither quality." "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation. I do not waste compliments on men who have not yet earned them." But she was smiling when she said it, and she did not move her hand away from where it rested near his on the hull, and Samuel thought, not for the first time that week, that he was in a great deal of trouble. On the 4th day, they took Glacia's half-repaired boat out along the base of the cliffs, ostensibly to test the new caulking against real water, though both of them understood it was also an excuse to see the caves Samuel had spoken of. The cliffs north of Saltmere rose sheer and pale, riddled with black mouths of caves that the tide filled and emptied twice a day, and local legend held that half of them connected to tunnels running back beneath the headland itself, old smugglers' work from 100 years past. Samuel had grown up hearing stories of drowned men and hidden gold in those caves, the kind of stories dockworkers told to frighten children away from exploring alone, but he had never had cause to actually row into one until Glacia Wildheart sat in the stern of her own boat with a coil of rope over one shoulder and said, "There, that mouth, the wide one. I can smell tar and wood smoke from here. You can smell that from this distance. Orc noses are better than yours. Row, shipwright, unless you would rather I take the oars myself and leave you to admire the view. He rowed. The cave swallowed them into cool shadow, the slap of water against stone echoing strangely, and within 100 feet, the passage widened into a chamber lit by torches jammed into cracks in the rock, where 3 rough boats lay beached on a shingle strand and a dozen men lounged around crates stamped with the harbormaster's own seal, Aldrich Vane seal, pressed into wax, plain as daylight. Samuel's stomach dropped. Glash's hand found his forearm, silent and warning, and they backed the boat soundlessly into a shadowed inlet before any of the men below noticed them. "There is your proof," Glash breathed, barely audible over the water's echo. "Vane is not merely taxing smugglers who avoid his tolls. He is paying pirates himself, using the harbor's own resources, probably reporting the losses as storm damage or piracy he cannot control, and pocketing whatever difference remains. It is a tidy little theft, wearing the mask of misfortune." "If we can prove that," Samuel whispered, "prove Vane's seal is on stolen goods being run through here, we could bring it before the Harbor Council. They'd have to remove him." "If we can prove it and live to say so," Glasha corrected. "There are a dozen armed men down there, and I do not intend to test my axe against a dozen swords for the sake of proving a point before we are ready." They rowed back out into daylight with the crate's seal burned into both their memories, and Samuel understood, with a lurch that had nothing to do with the boat's rocking, that whatever had begun on this dock 6 days ago had already grown far larger than a repaired hull. He was in it now. He supposed he had wanted to be, from the moment an orc woman put her axe against a knife-wielding thug's wrist to save a stranger's throat. Ren Corin lived in a stone cottage above the cliffs, half a mile past the last houses of Saltmere proper, with a view down over the harbor that she rarely enjoyed, curtains drawn against a world she had learned to distrust. She was perhaps 26, thin in a way that suggested grief eaten instead of food, with her father's sharp gray eyes set in a face gone wary and closed. She did not want to let them in at first. It was only when Samuel called through the door, familiar and gentle, "Ren, it's Samuel, I've brought someone who might be able to help, I swear it on your father's memory," that the bolt finally scraped back. Inside, over a pot of weak tea that Ren poured with visibly trembling hands, she told them what she had never told anyone else in Saltmere, that her father had been in perfect health the week before his death, that he had spoken to her the very morning he fell ill about a shipment of tariffs he intended to report to the Crown's regional governor, tariffs that Vane, then merely his deputy harbormaster, had been skimming for months. That her father had died within 2 days of a sudden wasting, fever no physician in Saltmere had ever seen the like of before or since. That the letter naming Vane as successor had appeared conveniently at his bedside, in handwriting that trembled but was, Ren insisted, subtly wrong in the shape of certain letters her father had made a particular way his whole life. No one would listen, Ren said, staring into her tea. Vane had already secured the loyalty of half the harbor guard by then, with coin, I assume, though I cannot prove that either. Anyone who spoke too loudly in my favor found reasons to leave town, or simply vanished from public notice. I stayed only because leaving felt like abandoning my father's name entirely, and because I had nowhere else to go. We found proof today that Vane is working with pirates out of the Slate Head Caves, Glasha said, using stolen goods marked with his own harbor seal. It will not undo your father's death, but it may be enough to break him if it is brought before the right ears. Ren's eyes came up, wet and disbelieving. The regional governor holds circuit court in Saltmere once a season. He is due within the month. If Vane were exposed before him publicly with witnesses, he would not survive the exposure, Glasha finished. Not politically, possibly not otherwise if he is the kind of man I suspect him to be. He is exactly that kind of man, Ren said quietly. Be careful, please. I have already lost my father to him. I could not bear it if I lost. She stopped herself, glancing between Samuel and Glacia with a flicker of something almost like hope. If I lost anyone else who was kind to me. They did not manage to keep the cave secret for long. 5 days later, as Samuel worked alone in his boat shed past sunset, 3 of Vane's harbor guard came through the door without knocking, and this time there was no crowd of witnesses on a public dock to make them cautious. "Word's come to the harbormaster," said the lead guard, a hard-faced man named Corbin Tull who wore the harbor's badge like it excused any cruelty done beneath it, "that you and your orc friend have been poking around Slate Head where you don't belong." Samuel set down his plane, slow and careful, aware of how few options a man had when cornered in his own shed by 3 armed men. "I don't know what you mean." "Course you don't." Tull's smile did not reach his eyes. "Harbormaster Vane's a patient man, Brooks, but he doesn't care much for shipwrights who forget their place or for foreign brutes who threaten his men on his own dock. He's decided your debt's due tomorrow. All of it. And if you can't pay, he let the sentence hang, glancing meaningfully at the half-finished hulls around them, the years of work they represented. Well, this shed reverts to harbor property. Simple as that. You can't do that. I've never missed a payment. You're behind 3 months, same as always, and the harbormaster's decided he's tired of waiting on his generosity. Tomorrow, Brooks, pay in full or lose the shed, the boat's in it, all of it." Tull's gaze slid sideways, considering. "And should the orc woman still be underfoot when we come to collect, well, harbormasters also decided orcs standing against his men on public docks ought to answer for it properly. Might be there's a formal accounting owed for that little display last week." They left without further violence, which Samuel understood even then was itself a kind of message. Vane did not need to break his kneecaps tonight. He only needed Samuel to understand how thin the ice beneath him had become. Glacia found him an hour later still sitting on the sawdust floor where the guards had left him, staring at nothing. "You look," she said, lowering herself to sit beside him with an easy, careless grace that belied the weight of her armor, "like a man who has just watched his entire life threatened by 3 cowards with borrowed authority." "That's about right." Samuel rubbed both hands over his face. "Vane wants my debt paid in full tomorrow or he takes the shed. 20 years of work gone because I mentioned his name too loud on a dock, and he's threatening to charge you too formally for what you did that first day." "Let him charge me." Glacia's voice went hard and flat as struck iron. "I would face him in a courtroom of his own choosing and still walk out with my axe unstained by anything but his cowardice. This isn't a joke, Glacia. He's already killed 1 harbormaster to get this seat. What's a shipwright and a foreign courier to a man like that?" Glacia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had lost its edge, gone low and rough in a way Samuel had not heard from her before. "Listen to me. I have crossed 3 kingdoms alone with nothing but an axe and my own wits, and I have not once in all that time found a man worth staying for, until I sat in this ruined shed and watched you rebuild a hull with more care than most men give their own children." She turned to face him fully, close enough that Samuel could smell wood smoke and salt on her skin, close enough that his breath caught somewhere behind his ribs. "I did not choose this fight because it was safe or wise. I chose it because you were in it and because a man like Vane does not deserve to win against a man like you. Do you understand me, Samuel Brooks?" Samuel's voice came out unsteady and he did not try to hide it. "I'm not anyone special, Glacia. I'm a shipwright with debts and no family and a mouth that gets me in trouble. You could walk away from this tonight and lose nothing but time." "You are wrong," Glacia said simply. "I would lose more than time. I have watched a great many men in my life, shipwright, warriors and kings and cowards alike, and I tell you plainly, I have never wanted to stay beside one the way I want to stay beside you." Her hand came up, slow and deliberate, to cup the side of his jaw, thumb brushing over the thin scar where Tull's blade had drawn blood the week before. "You are the first thing in a long time that has made me want to stop circling and simply land." Samuel did not know which of them moved first. He would wonder about that later, turning the memory over like a smooth stone, unable to decide if he had leaned in or if she had pulled him. And in the end it did not matter, because their mouths met with a hunger that had clearly been building beneath 6 days of teasing and testing and careful distances. And it was not gentle, not at first. Her hand fisted in the front of his shirt, his own hands finding the curve of her waist beneath her cloak. Both of them breathing like they had run the length of the harbor, and when they finally broke apart, foreheads still touching, Samuel laughed, breathless and disbelieving. "That's going to make it very hard to concentrate on saving the shed." "Good," Glasha murmured against his mouth. "I intend to make it very hard for you to concentrate on anything else, ever again." They did not have the coin to pay Vane's demand, of course, and both of them knew it. What they had instead, by morning, was a plan built from desperation, and the small, sharp advantage of a stolen half-hour spent copying the shape of a wax seal onto a scrap of parchment while Glasha kept watch. The regional governor's circuit court was due to convene in Saltmere's Market Square in 11 days, a fixed date that could not be moved by Vane's local authority. And it was the one place in the region where his private power meant nothing against the Crown's own justice. If they could bring Wren forward with her testimony and the proof of stolen goods bearing Vane's seal hidden in Slate Head Cave, before the governor and the assembled town, Vane would have no guards, no quiet threats, no convenient disappearances left to hide behind. The trouble was surviving 11 days. Vane, for his part, did not wait quietly. 2 days after the guard's visit, Samuel returned from delivering repaired oars to a fishing captain to find his boat shed's lock broken and half his tools missing. A message scrawled in chalk across the wall: "Pay or leave." 4 days after that, Wren's cottage was searched while she was out gathering water, her father's old ledgers taken, though she had already, on Glasha's advice, hidden the most damning pages sewn into the lining of her cloak. And 6 days before the governor's court, Vane made his boldest move yet. He sent Corbin Tull down to the dock at midday, in full view of the gathered fishwives and rope-makers and idle sailors, to formally challenge Samuel Brooks, not to a fight, for Vane was too cunning to risk his own men in an unwinnable brawl against an orc woman known to carry an axe, but to something with the appearance of law behind it. "Harbormaster Vane," Tull announced, loud enough to draw every eye on the dock, citing debts owed and public disturbance caused in defense of said debtor, invokes his right under old harbor custom to settle grievance by dueling ground. Samuel Brooks is named the offending party. The duel will be held at dawn in 3 days' time at the dueling ground above the cliffs, blades only, first blood or surrender, judged by the harbor's own officers. He let his eyes slide, deliberate and cruel, toward Glasha, who stood a few paces from Samuel with her jaw already tight. "Brooks may name a champion to stand for him, as is his right, given his known lack of skill with a blade. Though I doubt he'll find many willing to bleed for a man who owes what he owes." The old harbor custom was real enough. Samuel had heard of it, a relic from before the Crown's courts had extended fully to Saltmere, a way for grievances between free men to be settled with steel rather than endless appeals to distant judges. But he understood immediately what Vane intended, not merely to humiliate him, but to draw Glasha into the open in a fight sanctioned by Vane's own officers as judges, where any outcome could be twisted to suit Vane's purposes, and where, if she lost, Vane would have both his enemies broken in a single dawn, days before the governor's court could ever convene to hear their evidence. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. He knew, with the flat certainty of a man who had never held a blade in earnest in his life, that if he named himself, he would die on that dueling ground before the sun had fully cleared the cliffs, and every piece of proof they had gathered would die with him. "I accept the challenge," he said anyway, because pride and fear together made men say foolish things, and because some part of him could not stomach the idea of hiding behind a woman he had known for barely 2 weeks. Glacia's hand closed hard around his wrist before Tull could even smile at the answer. "He has the right to name a second to stand in his place," she said, loud enough for the whole dock to hear, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who had studied the old customs far more carefully than Tull expected a foreign courier to have done. "That right is not diminished by his own foolish courage. Samuel Brooks will name his second, as custom allows, before the sun sets 3 days from now." Tull's smile faltered just slightly. "Custom also says the second must be named freely, not coerced." "No one is coercing anyone," Glacia said, and something in her tone made even Tull take half a step back. "Tell your harbormaster his dawn is coming. Tell him also that he should pray whoever stands for Brooks has had a worse morning than the man he sends against her." The 3 days that followed were the strangest of Samuel's life, stretched taut between terror and something he did not yet have a name for, though it sat very near to hope. He tried twice to release Glacia from any expectation that she would fight for him. "You don't owe me this," he said the first night, sitting across from her in the boat shed by lantern light while she sharpened her axe with slow, deliberate strokes of a whetstone. "I got myself into this mess with my own mouth. You've already done more than enough." "I have decided many things about you in the past 2 weeks, Samuel Brooks," Glacia said without looking up from the blade, "but I have not yet decided that you get to tell me what I owe and do not owe. That decision belongs to me. Vane's man who'll fight you, whoever he is, he'll have trained for this. It's his job. I have killed warband raiders twice my size with less warning than 3 days," Glacia said, finally meeting his eyes, and there was no bravado in it, only plain fact stated plainly. "I am not afraid of Vane's chosen sword. I am afraid of what happens to you if I am wrong to be so certain, and so I will not be wrong. That is all there is to decide." The second attempt came the night before the duel itself, when Samuel, unable to sleep, found her outside the shed sitting on an overturned crate, sharpening stone finally set aside, simply watching the dark water of the harbor. "If something happens to you tomorrow," he said, sitting beside her, "I don't know what I'd do. I've been alone a long time, Glacia. I got used to it. I told myself it was fine. And then you walked onto my dock 2 weeks ago and put an axe against a man's wrist for a stranger, and now I can't remember how I managed being fine before that." He looked down at his own hands, rough and scarred from 20 years of tools. "I don't want to lose you before I've even had the chance to know what I've found." Glacia was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand in both of hers, turning it palm up, tracing one careful finger along the calluses there, as though reading some private map. "Among my people," she said, "when a warrior chooses someone to fight beside, it is not a small thing. It is not merely a favor between friends. It is a declaration. A warrior circles the ground where the fight will happen, more than once if the choosing matters enough, and only then does she name who stands with her, because once named, that bond does not break easily. It is closer to a vow than a favor." She looked up at him, amber eyes catching what little starlight came down between the clouds. "I have circled other grounds before, Samuel, for other causes, and named other seconds, comrades, allies, nothing more. Tomorrow will not be like those times. I want you to understand that, whatever happens." Samuel did not fully understand what she meant, not yet, though the words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he could not yet trace to their edges. "I understand that I love you," he said instead, because it was true and because tomorrow felt too uncertain to leave it unsaid, "even if it's too soon, even if it's foolish, even if you laugh at me for saying it after 2 weeks. Glacia did not laugh. She leaned forward and kissed him slow and deep, one hand cradling the back of his neck, and when she drew back her voice was rough with an emotion she did not bother to hide. "It is not too soon. I do not waste time deciding what I already know. Now sleep, shipwright, if you can. Tomorrow I intend to make Vane regret every choice that brought him to this dawn." The dueling ground above the cliffs was an old flat stretch of headland, ringed with weathered stones worn smooth by 100 years of use for exactly this purpose. And by the time the sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise, gray shading toward gold, half of Saltmere had gathered along its edges to watch. Samuel stood near the front of the crowd with Ren Corin beside him, both of them pale and silent, watching as Vane's officers marked the boundary of the ground, with lengths of white rope staked into the earth. Corbin Tull stood near the center, resplendent in the harbor's colors, clearly relishing his role as officiating cruelty dressed up as procedure. Aldrich Vane himself stood apart, a tall, silver-templed man with the kind of handsome, untroubled face that men trusted instinctively and should not have, watching the preparations with the patient satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome already decided. And then Vane's chosen champion stepped onto the ground, and a murmur ran through the crowd, because it was not one of the harbor guard at all. It was a mercenary Samuel had never seen before, a huge, scarred man in blackened plate armor who carried a longsword like he had been born gripping one, a professional duelist clearly brought in from outside Saltmere specifically for this purpose. Vane, it seemed, had not intended to leave anything to chance. "Where is your second, shipwright?" Tull called across the ground, loud enough to carry. "Custom says she must be formally named before the fight begins, or the challenge defaults and the debt stands owed in full plus penalty." Samuel's throat had gone dry. He looked toward the edge of the crowd, where Glacia had insisted on waiting apart until the moment of naming, and found her already walking toward the ground's boundary. And what happened next was the thing Samuel would remember most clearly for the rest of his life, more clearly even than the fight that followed. She did not simply walk onto the ground and stand beside him. She walked its edge first, slow and deliberate, one full circuit around the entire ringed boundary, her cloak stirring in the cliff wind, her amber eyes moving over the assembled crowd, over Vane's mercenary, over Tull, over the white rope staked into old earth soaked with 100 years of settled grievances. The crowd went hushed, uncertain what they were witnessing, and Samuel himself did not fully understand it either, though he remembered, distantly, what she had told him the night before about circling and choosing and vows that did not break easily. She circled a second time, slower still, and this time her eyes found Samuel and held there, and something passed between them in that look that had nothing to do with the mercenary or Vane or the watching crowd at all, something that felt, to Samuel, like being weighed on a scale only she could see, and found, impossibly, worthy. Then she stopped in front of him, close enough that her cloak brushed his boots, and turned to face the assembled crowd, her voice pitched to carry across the entire headland. "I name Samuel Brooks as the man I choose to stand for," she said. "Not because custom demands I name someone, but because there is no one else on this cliff or in this harbor or in any harbor I have ever sailed past that I would rather fight for. I have circled grounds before for lesser causes. I will not circle this one again. This is my choosing, made freely, and I will defend it with my life if that is what today requires." The crowd's murmur rose and broke like a wave, half of them clearly moved despite themselves, half of them exchanging uneasy glances at an orc woman speaking of choosing a human man in words that sounded, to anyone who knew even a little of orc custom, far closer to a claiming than a mere agreement to fight. Vane's untroubled expression flickered, just slightly, as though he had not accounted for the possibility that his intended humiliation might instead become something the whole town would remember as beautiful. "Touching," Tull called out, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Sentiment doesn't stop a blade. Take your positions." The fight that followed lasted less than 4 minutes, though it felt to Samuel, standing helpless at the boundary with his hands clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms, like the longest 4 minutes of his life. Vane's mercenary was fast for his size, faster than his bulk suggested he should be, and in the opening exchange, He drove Glacia back 3 full steps with a series of heavy overhand blows that rang off her axe haft like a smith's hammer against an anvil. The crowd gasped as one when his blade caught her along the shoulder, a shallow cut that darkened the leather there, and Samuel's heart nearly stopped. But Glacia only rolled her shoulder once, as though shrugging off an insect bite, and grinned at the mercenary with a fierceness that made the man's confident stride falter for the first time. "Is that your best?" she called, circling now not around a boundary but around him, forcing him to turn, to expend effort tracking her rather than simply charging forward. "I have felt harder blows from children throwing stones." The mercenary's answer was a furious lunge, overextended in his anger, and Glacia met it not with her axe's blade but with the flat of its haft, knocking the longsword wide, stepping into the opening his overreach had created, and driving her shoulder into his chest with the force of a falling tree. He staggered back, boots skidding on the dew-damp grass, and before he could fully recover his balance, she had reversed her grip and brought the axe's blunt spine down across his sword arm with a crack that Samuel heard even from the boundary. The mercenary's sword fell from fingers that no longer obeyed him. He dropped to one knee, cradling the arm, and the fight, by the old custom of first blood or surrender, was over. The crowd erupted, a ragged, disbelieving cheer that started somewhere near the back and rolled forward, and Samuel found himself pushing through the loosening boundary rope before he had consciously decided to move, reaching Glacia as she lowered her axe, breathing hard but standing tall, blood from the shoulder wound tracking a dark line down her arm. "You're hurt," he said, hands already at her shoulder, though she caught his wrist gently before he could fuss further. "It is nothing," she said, though her voice was rough with exertion and something else, something warm that softened her whole face as she looked at him. "I told you I did not intend to lose." Vane, across the ground, had gone very still, his face a careful mask that could not quite hide the fury beneath it. He had lost his champion, lost his intended humiliation, and lost it publicly before half his harbor, and Samuel could see him already calculating how to salvage what remained of his authority. "The duel is settled," Vane said, voice tight. "The debt, however, remains. This changes nothing of what is owed." "No," Glacia agreed, stepping forward, her axe still loose but ready in her hand. "But it changes who stands willing to speak against you, and how loudly, when the governor's court convenes in 6 days. Ask yourself, harbormaster, how many of these witnesses will now find their courage, having watched your paid champion fall before a woman you no doubt expected to break?" Vane's eyes swept the crowd, and Samuel watched something cold settle into his expression as he saw it too. The murmurs, the glances, the fishwives and rope makers no longer looking at him with the automatic deference 2 weeks of fear had bought him, but with the particular, dangerous curiosity of people who had just watched power fail to protect itself. He turned and left the dueling ground without another word, Tull and his officers trailing after him, and the crowd slowly began to disperse, buzzing with a version of the morning's events that would be retold in every tavern in Saltmere by nightfall, growing more dramatic with each retelling, though Samuel suspected it would need very little exaggeration to remain the most remarkable thing most of them had ever witnessed. That night, Samuel finally understood the fuller weight of what Glacia had told him about circling and choosing. They sat together in the boat shed, her shoulder freshly bandaged with linen Samuel had wrapped himself, his hands steadier now than they had been that morning, though not by much. The lantern light gilded the planes of her face, and she watched him work with a patience that felt, to Samuel, like being studied by someone deciding whether to keep what she had found. "Tell me about the circling," he said, tying off the bandage's end. "You said it was closer to a vow than a favor. What did you vow out there, when you walked the ground twice before you named me?" Glacia was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer, and when she spoke her voice had none of its usual teasing edge, only a raw honesty that made Samuel's chest ache. "Among my people, when a warrior circles a dueling ground before choosing her second, she is not merely selecting a champion. She is declaring before witnesses, whose life she considers worth risking her own to protect, and whose honor she claims as bound to hers from that moment forward. It is rarely done for anyone outside a warrior's own clan, and almost never for someone outside our people entirely. I circled once for the weight of the choice. I circled twice because I wanted every soul on that cliff to understand I was not choosing carelessly, nor quickly, nor out of mere obligation. She reached out and took his hand, the same slow, deliberate gesture from the night before. I was choosing you, Samuel Brooks, not as a favor, not as payment for a repaired hull or a defended throat. I was declaring, in the only language my people have for such things, that I intend to stay, and that anyone who wishes to harm you must now answer to me first. Samuel felt something crack open in his chest, some old, careful wall he had built over 15 years of solitary dock work and unanswered letters, and a family that had drifted away or died until none remained who wrote to him. "No one has ever chosen me like that," he said, voice unsteady. "Not once in my whole life. I didn't know it was something a person could do for another person. Choose them and mean it that completely." "Then you have simply never met the right person before," Glacia said, and there was no arrogance in it, only a quiet certainty. "I have crossed 3 kingdoms, Samuel. I have fought raiders and pirates, and once, memorably, a bear that mistook my camp for its own territory. I am not easily impressed, and I am not easily kept. But you rebuilt a stranger's hull with the same care you would give your own life's work, and you called out a harbormaster's corruption knowing it might cost you everything, and you offered yourself as a duelist against a trained killer rather than let me stand alone, even knowing you would surely die for the gesture. I do not choose weak men, Samuel Brooks, and I do not choose men who bore me. I chose you because you are neither, and because when I imagine sailing away from this harbor without you in it, the thought sits in my chest like a wound that will not close." Samuel closed the distance between them and kissed her, careful of her bandaged shoulder, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them, no careful testing of boundaries. Only the accumulated hunger of 2 weeks spent circling each other in their own way, teasing and testing and drawing closer by careful inches, finally allowed to close entirely. Her hands found the buttons of his shirt, unhurried despite the urgency beneath her touch, and his found the laces of her leather armor, and between kisses she murmured something low and rough in the language of her own people that Samuel did not understand but felt, somehow, that he did not need to. The lantern burned low and then out, and the boat shed, full of the smell of pitch and sawdust and salt, became for one night something far warmer than a workshop became. In the quiet hours after, the place where Samuel Brooks stopped being merely a lonely man with a shed full of debts, and started being a man who had, against every reasonable expectation of his ordinary life, been chosen. The governor's circuit court convened 6 days later in Saltmere's Market Square, beneath a canvas awning strung between the old stone well and the fish auction block. And by the time the regional governor's clerk called the session open, the square was as full as Samuel had ever seen it, every stall abandoned in favor of the drama everyone in town already knew was coming. Ren Corin testified first, her voice shaking at the start but steadying as she spoke, laying out her father's final days, the wrongness of the handwriting in the letter that had named Vane his successor, the tariffs her father had intended to report before his sudden, unexplained fever. She produced the hidden ledger pages sewn into her cloak's lining, columns of figures that did not match the harbor's official records, discrepancies that had been quietly bleeding coin from Saltmere's coffers for 2 years. Then Glacia stood and described in plain, unflinching detail what they had found in the cave beneath Slate Head. The crates stamped with Vane's own harbor seal, the men lounging beside stolen goods with the easy comfort of employees rather than opportunistic thieves, the clear evidence that the harbormaster himself had been paying pirates from the very tolls he claimed protected honest trade. Vane, given the chance to answer, tried first denial, then indignation, then, as the governor's cold, patient questions picked apart each claim in turn, something closer to desperation. He accused Glacia of fabricating evidence, accused Wren of grief-addled fantasy, accused Samuel of conspiring with a foreign smuggler to destroy an honest harbormaster's reputation out of simple spite over unpaid debts. But the governor had brought his own officers, and sent them that same afternoon up to Slate Head with Samuel and Glacia as guides, and returned by evening with 3 crates seized and 2 of the pirates in custody, both of whom, faced with the certainty of a crown magistrate's justice rather than Vane's private protection, gave up his name within the hour in exchange for leniency. By nightfall, Aldrich Vane was in chains in the harbor's own jail, awaiting transport to the regional seat for proper trial, and the governor had already begun the process of formally restoring Wren Corin's disputed claim to her father's old position, pending a proper hearing, though everyone in the square understood which way that hearing would surely go. Samuel stood at the edge of the crowd as the jail door closed on Vane's furious, unraveling protests, and felt Glacia's hand slide into his, warm and certain, and thought that he had never in his life felt so thoroughly, completely relieved. "It's over," he said. "That part is over," Glacia agreed. "The rest, I think, is only beginning." She squeezed his hand, and there was something in her voice, warm and teasing and entirely sincere all at once, that made him turn to look at her properly. "Unless you intend to send me away now that your debts are settled and your name is cleared, shipwright, I have heard men grow strangely shy once the danger passes." "I'm not sending you anywhere," Samuel said, and meant it with his whole chest. "I don't think I could, even if I tried. You circled that ground twice before you chose me, Glacia. I intend to make sure you never regret not circling a 3rd time to change your mind." Glacia laughed, low and delighted, and pulled him close, heedless of the crowd still milling around the square. "I have never once regretted a choosing, Samuel Brooks. I do not intend to start with you." The months that followed were not without their own small dramas, the kind that came naturally to a harbor town rebuilding itself after corruption had been cut out like rot from old wood. Wren Corin was formally confirmed as harbormaster within the season, and one of her first acts was to forgive every debt Vane's administration had inflated or invented, including the whole of what remained owed on Samuel's boat shed, a gesture she made not as charity but, she insisted, as simple correction of a wrong done under a false authority. There were harder moments, too, quieter but no less real. Not everyone in Saltmere welcomed an orc woman settling openly in their harbor town, and Samuel watched, more than once, the flicker of old prejudice cross a stranger's face at the market when Glacia walked beside him, watched shopkeepers grow suddenly formal and careful in ways that had nothing to do with courtesy. Glacia bore it with the same fierce, unbothered pride she brought to everything else, though Samuel noticed she gripped his hand a little tighter on the days it happened, and he made a point, every time, of standing close enough that no one could pretend not to see whose side he had chosen. "They will come around, some of them," Glacia said one evening, months into their life together, as they sat on the boat shed's rebuilt dock watching the sun go down gold and heavy over the water. "Or they will not, and it will not matter because I did not come to this harbor to be loved by strangers. I came to be loved by you, and that I already have in abundance." "You have it," Samuel confirmed, pulling her closer against his side, her head fitting naturally against his shoulder now, a comfortable weight he had grown to need the way he needed the sound of the tide. "For as long as you'll keep me." "That," Glacia said, tilting her face up to kiss him slow and warm in the fading light, "will be considerably longer than either of us can currently imagine, shipwright. I have already decided. You do not get to argue." He did not argue. He had learned, in the year since an orc woman had walked onto his dock with an axe in her hand, and changed the entire shape of his life, that arguing with Glacia Wildheart when she had decided something was rarely worth the effort, and never once worth the loss of what she offered in its place. A year to the day after Farron Dask had first held a knife to his throat, Samuel Brooks stood on the same dock, now busier and more prosperous under Ren Corin's honest hand, finishing the last coat of pitch on a new hull built not for a stranger's commission but for himself and Glacia both. A proper cutter, sturdy enough for coastal runs, fast enough to outrun trouble if trouble ever came looking for them again, which, given the year they had lived through, seemed a reasonable precaution rather than idle worry. Glacia arrived as the sun was setting, still in her familiar rust-colored leathers, though the cloak pinned at her shoulder was new, a gift Samuel had commissioned from the town's one skilled leatherworker, dyed a deep green that suited her better than the old travel-worn gray. She stopped at the edge of the dock and looked at the finished hull for a long moment, something soft moving across her sharp, beautiful face. "You finished it," she said. "Finished it this morning. Thought we could take her out at first light. See how she handles. And where would we sail her once we know she handles well?" Samuel set down his brush and looked at the woman who had walked into his life circling danger and chosen him in front of an entire watching town, who had bled for his honor on a clifftop dueling ground and never once let him doubt, in all the months since, that the choice had been anything less than deliberate and complete. "Wherever you want," he said. "I built her big enough for two, with room to spare, because I intend that to be a permanent arrangement, not a passing one." Glacia crossed the dock and kissed him, unhurried, the ease of a year's certainty in it rather than the hungry uncertainty of their first stolen night, though the heat beneath it had never once cooled, only settled into something deeper and more constant, like a hearth fire banked to burn slow and long. "Then we sail together," she said against his mouth, "wherever the coast takes us, and we come home again to this dock, because I find I have grown fond of this particular harbor, difficult neighbors and all." She pulled back just far enough to look at him properly, amber eyes bright with the last of the sunset. "I circled that dueling ground twice, Samuel Brooks, before I named you. Do you remember what I told you it meant?" "A vow," Samuel said. "Not a favor." "A vow," Glacia agreed. "I have never once regretted keeping it, not for a single day since. I do not intend to start regretting it now, or in whatever years the two of us are given, however many that turns out to be." She took his rough, pitch-stained hand in both of hers, the same gesture from that first frightened night before the duel, and pressed it to her chest, over the steady, certain beat of her heart. "You were the man I chose, out of every soul on that headland, out of every man I have ever met in 3 kingdoms of wandering. I would circle that ground 100 times over and choose you again every single time." The last light slipped below the horizon, gilding the harbor gold and then deep blue, and Samuel Brooks, once the loneliest man on Saltmere's docks, stood with the woman who had chosen him fiercely and completely, and without a single moment of regret, and understood, at last, exactly what it meant to no longer be alone.